How are y'all doing?
Good. Good
Thank
morning.
you, Howdy.
So Andrea and Elizabeth, are you ready to get us started? Let's do it.
Yep. Sounds good. Okay. So I'm going to start us off by just doing a quick summary of Jacqueline's talk. If you remember back on March 8th. So we heard from Jacqueline Gill about her work with Dulcinea Groff and Kit Hamley, titled Seabird Establishment in the Falkland Islands Triggered an Ecosystem Shift 5,000 Years Ago. So on the Falkland Islands, Poa flabellata, native tussock grass species, forms a coastal fringe ecosystem that is essential for the island's very diverse seabird populations. This tussock grass grows on pedicels of peat, and the peat and therefore the grasses are being threatened by overgrazing by sheep populations on the islands and coastal erosion. So restoration efforts have been largely unsuccessful because of the fencing out of the sheep that were trampling restored tussock grass. Managers were also fencing out penguin populations. And as it turns out, these tussock grasses and penguins have a mutualistic relationship where the birds provide essential nutrients for the grass and the grass provides nesting sites for these birds. So the team in the Beast Lab hypothesized that this mutualism between birds and grass would likely be sensitive to abrupt changes in climate. They thought that during periods of increased wind intensity from the westerlies, there would be an increase in ocean upwelling, therefore increased nutrient input, more birds feeding in this nutritious ocean, and then the birds would provide increased nutrition for the grasses, which would then affect plant productivity. And then as the westerlies shifted away during periods of climate change, this would all get flipped on its head, meaning less food for birds from the ocean and a decline in plant productivity. To assess this hypothesis, they excavated columns of peat and used the peat to construct high resolution multi-proxy records to better understand when seabird populations were established at the site. And the record showed that seabirds established around 5,000 years ago, which corresponded with the increase in plant productivity. However, contrary to their original hypothesis, wind intensity did not correlate with seabird establishment, but rather a decrease in sea surface temperatures and an increase in sea ice seemed to have more to do with seabird establishment. So it turns out the birds were probably using these islands as a refuge from cold climate in the southern hemisphere. And this is a problem today under current climate change because it is unknown where a warm climate refuge may be for these bird populations. And I'll pass it over to Elizabeth for the second talk.
Sure, thanks. So Jasmine Saros introduced the new Arctic National Research Traineeship, or NRT, called Systems Approaches to Understanding and Navigating the New Arctic, or SANA for short. So Jasmine outlined opportunities that will be available to UMaine students, especially in the 2021 to 2022 academic year. The SANA program pulls together several of UMaine's strengths, including polar research, cross-cultural perspectives, and the integration of knowledge systems, Arctic law and policy, and socio-environmental systems research. UMaine students can participate in the entire program either as a fellow, or they can participate in select elements. And these include a research forum, courses, field experiences, and an interdisciplinary collaborative research. So these opportunities are open to master's, PhD, and law students. Some of the elements that Jasmine reviewed for next year include a weekly Arctic research forum in the fall, which is open to all interested students and faculty. There'll also be 2 courses in the spring. One is a single credit course from Darren Renko on integrating Indigenous knowledge in climate science. And then there'll be a 3-credit course on Arctic complex systems taught by multiple faculty. A new field course will be offered for the first time in the summer of 22, and that'll be offered for 4 years total through 2025. And this will be a four-week field course, field experience in Southwest Greenland. It'll be split between socio-environmental system surveys for 10 days and then 10 days of collaborative research projects. The field experience will have room for up to 8 graduate students and 3 to 4 undergrads, and travel costs will be covered. Jasmine also noted that there are some additional programs in the works, including professional development workshops and possibly a graduate certificate. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker today. And Nicholas Whiteman will be presenting on his work examining fluid and solid interactions with smooth particle hydrodynamics.
Thank you. Let's see if that'll share. All right. Let me begin by expressing just how pained I am that the latency of this format will sabotage the true high fidelity of these fluid simulations that I'm here to share with you today. I'm a graduate student with the SCCS CCI, working with Dr. Peter Koons and studying fluid-solid interactions with a focus on coastal erosion and more recently, airflow in interior spaces, as we'll see later on. If I get ahead of you, please warn me. These slides don't seem to respond as quickly as I would like. But as we are here today addressing the Born Symposium, I'll lean on this video. It shouldn't take much convincing to stress that understanding fluid-solid interactions are essential in our world for climate forcing, for changing shorelines, all the way down to our weekends and our well-beings. So I'm here to talk about how we go to address these problems. We were lucky enough to have Mark Jordan introduce us to smooth particle hydrodynamics earlier in the series, but for new viewers, we're using Dual S Physics, which is an open source and GPU accelerated set of codes based on the S Physics hydrodynamics solvers. It's a particle-based method of studying free surface fluid flow and provides full Navier-Stokes solutions. And with the efficiency of parallel GPU processing, it facilitates high-resolution modeling even in 3D. Just a quick introduction again to a particle-based method. It uses a sampling kernel to weigh the influence of adjacent forces from particles nearby. This grants freedom of movement to the computational nodes, unlike in a mesh system. So these particles are all solving the partial differential equations involved locally and communicating with their neighbors in a weighted fashion. And this allows us to produce solutions with complex dynamic behaviors. In the case you see before us, every particle is colored uniquely to its numerical identifier. And so we can begin to see mixing or not mixing in the shadow of this obstacle. Did I mention actually that these were 3D solutions as well? And so at the top, we're seeing our mixing, and beneath at this oblique angle, we can start to see the velocity shadow behind the obstacle. But we'll just take one close look quickly at these particles before I move on. These particle-based methods allow for propagation of the inertial terms of these equations and allow for a transition to turbulent behavior. And you'll have to excuse me for covering the color scales. The two on the left are again colored by their identifiers. So it shows mixing. It shows how the older particles are lingering in the eddies beyond as new particles flow past. Middle right, we have our velocity coloration here. We can see that low velocity zones behind an obstacle is something that we'll be interested in later on in the talk. And finally, to the right, a highly filtered rendering of the data set that's showing the vorticity, or the amount of swirling that's occurring on a logarithmic scale in the same model you see before you. So, as I mentioned, this allows for these turbulent behaviors, and this is something we haven't been able to do until very recently, which opens the door to studying fluid dynamics within environments and habitats that are fundamentally defined by fluid-solid interactions. And here we're measuring just the forces of waves as they kind of roll gently onto a nearshore setting. Touching back on earlier work by Nick Richmond, and akin to what Mark Jordan had introduced us to with river restoration and habitat restoration, on the question of habitat often is, can obstacles in a stream or river, such as historic boom islands, provide a low velocity zone that might be of use or rest for various species? And here Nick had colored for a desirable range to explore with SPH if this was indeed true. But it's important to consider our own habitats. I'll spare you the summary of the year, but as we've seen, this hallway may be familiar to many of you, and we want to question the airflow around us in confined spaces. The physics is the same. The fluid is slightly different, but as we can see how eddies may draft behind a person moving through the hallway, and how these airflow patterns may linger on features along the hallway as well. But we're also focused on multi-scale problems. And here we just see some particles breaking on a coastal bluff. And this was drawn from photogrammetry. I'll make a quick aside in that one of our long-term goals moving forward is to begin coupling atmospheric and oceanographic measurements from broader, mesoscale climate models, polar wharf, oceanographic information to begin informing local behaviors and interactions. But that's briefly an aside. We were lucky enough earlier in the series to be introduced to photogrammetry and structure from motion by Emily Blackwood. And this is something that allows us to characterize real world structures in exceptional resolution. This is something that I've been working on for the past few years with my master's. And I'll just share this slide here where we have glacial sediments being eroded at the coast. On the top, we have the publicly available LiDAR for the area. And then we have a 1.2 centimeter pixel resolution photo scan of the same scene. And you can see the quality of detail that we capture in the nearshore marsh environments that may interact with waves and the slumping of the slope there, the snow behavior. And we have the added advantage that it's captured in true color. So structure of motion isn't fun without any motion, but being able to capture a high resolution 3D snapshot of an environment in time, especially one as dynamic as a coastal environment, is really critical, as promising as we move forward to begin triaging, say, the loss of culturally significant habitat sites or this shell midden that we see here, being able to capture it and then study it in a dynamic way. So we've seen that fluid-solid interactions at the local level are not only influenced by global climate, mesoscale drivers, but their own effects also propagate to larger scales and can have regional consequences. And I don't mean to take it for granted, but it's pretty exciting to have some breaking waves here before you today. And so I'll close and I'll wrap up with another look at our North Alaskan permafrost erosion. It's one of the fastest changing shorelines in the entire world. And here we see it gradually being removed bit by bit, piece by piece on a smaller local scale. With that, I'll take any questions. I'd like to thank you all for being here. Thank my partners in crime with the numerical modeling facility as well.
So are there any questions for Nicholas?
I have a question, Nick.
Shoot.
I was wondering what scale you could possibly go down to, like if I wanted to model a microscopic organism and the fluid flowing around it. Is that a viable option with this?
So I'd have to speculate. I'm not sure we've gone down molecular, but I believe an organism could be imitated. Certainly some of these models can be scaled down to quite fine resolution. It's a numerical and it's very proportional because it's a particle-based system. So I'm not ruling it out. I just don't have an answer whether or not it's been tested or not.
Okay, great, thanks.
Depends on your computer power.
Yeah, right.
We're lucky to have the HPC, the Advanced Computing Group here at UMaine.
Do we have any other questions? All right, we'll go ahead and move on to our next presentation. This is from Lynn Kaluzienski, and she'll be presenting on her work modeling Ross ice shelf sensitivity to changes along its western lateral margin. Let me just get it.
Hopefully this is set up correctly. Great, so yes, I will be talking about some of the modeling work that I've been doing on the Ross ice shelf. Some of the results I'm presenting today aren't quite finalized, so I'm open to comments and questions at the end of the seminar. Almost 70% of the Antarctic ice sheet drains into floating ice shelves. Understanding the controls and ice shelf stability is critical to predict the future evolution of the Antarctic ice sheet and subsequent sea level rise. So while there are several controls on ice shelf stability, lateral shear margins are particularly important regions within ice shelves. This is an example of a shear margin along Pine Island Glacier in West Antarctica. As ice flow is primarily restrained by drag along these regions due to the fact that there is no resistance underneath the ice shelf, these regions represent a critical control on ice shelf mass balance. Lateral shear zones destabilization often follows a pattern. Initially, submarine melt causes thinning, and this increases the margin's susceptibility to fractures and crevassing. This in turn reduces the load-bearing surface area and lateral drag provided to the ice shelf. And then ultimately, this results in a loss of resistance upstream at the grounding line, or the boundary where a grounded glacier becomes a floating ice shelf. It's this loss of resistance at the grounding line that can contribute to an increase in flux and contribute to sea level rise. The work I'm presenting today focuses on the Ross ice shelf and its western lateral margin. So just a brief comment about orientation. North is going to be pointing down, and thus the west is going to be on the right side. I'll start with a brief introduction on large-scale Ross ice shelf dynamics. Several recent studies have explored the buttressing potential of Antarctic ice shelves, so their ability to provide resistance at the grounding line. One modeling study that I'd like to highlight is that of Rees et al. They ended up coining a term that I really like. It's called telebuttressing. And it's the idea that localized ice shelf thinning can accelerate ice flow in regions far from that initial perturbation. So for their model setup, they split their domain into 20 by 20 kilometer grid cells, and then they individually thinned each cell by a meter. So this figure is showing the maximum response distance for each grid cell. So for example, a moderate thinning within this region can accelerate ice flow almost up to 1,000 kilometers away. So it's because of this that they really highlight the western margin as a particularly sensitive to thinning. So if we look at basal melt rate estimates, here are some summer melt rates predicted by an ocean circulation model. They show the melt rate to be abnormally high, so up to about 10 meters a year along this margin. And other studies put the total yearly melt rates between 1 and 3 meters per year. So if we combine these observations of melt with the previous modeling studies, the implication is that this western lateral margin is a key area of vulnerability. So not only are we predicting that moderate thinning in this region could have far-reaching effects, we're actually estimating the basal melt rates to be comparable to those case studies. So let's zoom into a little bit more into this region. I found these findings particularly interesting because my colleagues and I have traveled to the western lateral margin over several field seasons. Over many years, we've collected GPS and ground penetrating radar data to study the structure and kinematics of this region. One important finding that's come out of this work is the evidence for basal marine ice. So it's ice frozen on underneath the ice shelf. So this is a 200 megahertz GPR transect that's following 5.7 kilometers across the shear zone. And so we were able to pick up a bright reflector at around 160 meter depth, which we interpreted to be the transition from meteoric ice, so previously glacier ice, to ice that has frozen on underneath the ice shelf, this marine ice layer. And we were able to penetrate another 10 meters into the marine ice layer before losing signal. So we know that the ice is at least 170 to 180 meters thick in this region. So using this information, we wanted to get a better estimate of the total ice thickness across the shear margin. So assuming hydrostatic equilibrium and making various assumptions about the density of firn, meteoric ice, and marine ice, we were able to estimate the ice thickness to be between 190 to 220 meters depth. So these two lines are estimates assuming two different basal marine ice densities because we don't have a full understanding of how dense that ice should be. So about 40 to 60 meters of that thickness is due to the marine ice layer. So if we compare our estimates with some of the widely used remote sensing data sets of ice thickness, we can quickly see a considerable discrepancy. So this top line is the BEDMAT2 data set. And this is the data set that's most commonly used in modeling studies up to this point. All the ones at the beginning were using this BEDMAT2 scenario. So our estimates of ice thickness are more than 3 times that of BEDMAT2. And even our direct observations, so how far we were able to penetrate into the ice shelf, are thicker than these two newer data sets of BED Machine and Rosetta. So what does this discrepancy mean for sensitivity changes in the region? The good news is that while we believe Rosetta and BED Machine are still underestimating the total ice thickness in this region, they are still far better than BEDMAT2. They're more than twice as thick as BEDMAT2. So to investigate this, I initialized a comparison study within the ice sheet system model. This is a thermomechanical finite element model of ice flow. And I utilized the BEDMAT2 and BED Machine data sets to compare, with the idea being that the BED Machine data set is closer to our observations. I don't have time to go into the methods too much, but essentially I utilized the ISSM model to investigate various thinning scenarios. So here is an example of the model solution for velocity solving a simple stress balance solution. And the white lines are the cells within the model and the model mesh. And I initialized 2 separate scenarios. So the first, again, initialized by BEDMAT2, the second initialized by BED Machine geometry. And then I thinned each scenario a 20 by 20 kilometer portion by 2 meters. So if we visualize the difference between BED Machine and BEDMAT2 initial ice thicknesses, and if we zoom into our area of interest, we see that BED Machine ice is more than 100 kilometers thicker than that of BEDMAT2. So for my initial model scenario, again, I applied a 2 meter thinning to this 20 by 20 kilometer grid cell. And then I solved 2 separate stress balance solutions for each of the scenarios. So here are the results comparing the change in velocity magnitude due to the same perturbation of 2 meters thinning for each. So BEDMAT2 is on the left and BED Machine is on the right. And as we would expect, BEDMAT2 shows a greater change in velocity in response to the same perturbation. And this is because it's thinner ice to begin with. So you're removing a greater portion of the ice shelf. What is interesting is that both of these scenarios seem to have somewhat of a similar distance associated with that velocity forcing. So we're still seeing changes far away from the perturbation, even though they're 2 different geometries. So after our initial stress balance solution, I wanted to take this a little further and explore transient scenarios, as well as explore more of a spatial sensitivity to the same amount of thinning. So I chose 5 separate case studies along the lateral margin, and I ran a 25-year transient solution for each of these case studies. And I solved for a mass transport and stress balance solution. For each of the transient solutions, we can compare the change in flux across the grounding line. On the left, I have an illustration of each of those case studies in reference to the difference in ice thickness between the BED Machine and BEDMAT2 scenarios. And then on the right, I have the change in flux over the 25-year period. And each of the graphs line up vertically with the case studies that they correlate to. The BEDMAT2 results are represented by the solid line, and the BED bed machine results are shown by the outlined symbols. So we're not going to dive into everything into this plot, but I would like to point out a couple of patterns. So similar to the initial stress balance solution, case studies 2 through 5 show that BedMap2 scenario is more sensitive to that same amount of thinning. However, we had the opposite for case 1, and this actually makes sense if we look over at our difference plot. We see that bed machine was actually thicker to begin with in this scenario. Sorry, bed machine was actually thinner than BedMap2 in this scenario. If we look more closely, we can see other patterns as well. For one, the difference in the change in flux for the bed machine and BedMap2 scenarios diverge over time. Some scenarios, such as case 5, actually diverge more than others. So there is somewhat of a spatial sensitivity to the same amount of forcing. Case study 5 seems to have the largest discrepancy in flux. And this is despite the fact that it seems to have the least amount of difference in the initial thickness. But this does make more sense if we look at the relative thickness change for each scenario. So this is looking at the relative thickness change compared to the sum of the flux difference. We actually see somewhat of a linear correlation between these two. For example, case 5 has a 10% reduction in its total thickness and ends up having the largest change in flux due to that. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. If you look at case study 5, and this is again the BedMap2 scenario, it too had almost a 2% reduction in change in thickness. And yet these two case studies ended up having a much different change in flux. So one possible reason for this is that while I'm thinning the same amount of ice from each of the scenarios, I'm thinning ice of a different rheology or ice hardness. For example, I could be thinning ice that's stiffer or softer. Another possibility is that I'm thinning ice of a different strain regime. So I could be thinning ice that's in compression in one area versus ice that's in extension in another area. So these are the kinds of areas that these are the kinds of questions that I want to continue addressing with my further modeling work. So to wrap things up, our GPR observations show that ice thickness is greatly underestimated within the BedMap2 dataset, which has been widely used in modeling studies. By comparing models initialized by BedMap2 and BedMachine, which is closer to our ice thickness estimates, we know that the stress balance and flux across the grounding line is particularly sensitive to your initial thickness estimate. Because the western lateral margin of the Ross Ice Shelf is an area of vulnerability, better ice thickness estimates are key to predicting the future evolution of the Ross Ice Shelf. And on the larger scale, better estimates of ice thickness could be improved by knowing where marine ice is, its thickness, and its particular density. So I'll leave up my conclusions and some ideas for future work and welcome questions.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, shout away.
If there are no questions, I do have some closing remarks or comments on the two papers. Nicholas told us how coastlines go with the flow. He's studying a turbulent issue and his models generate a mixed message about particle interactions. One of the hallmarks of the work that he showed us is its relevance to airflow in our own daily environments, of particular interest given what may be circulating in the air. And this is not something we want to just wave off. Lynn presented some off-the-shelf research on ice in Antarctica. She's concerned in part with the resistance movement. Lynn is doggedly pursuing a better understanding of Ross Shelf ice dynamics through thick and thin. which involves a lot of stress and requires a real balancing act. She compared two models to field data, but at the end asked, what's the difference? It sounds as though there are still some questions to be answered before this study can be put to bed. Thank you. And I guess we end early today. We'll see you all at the next one. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.